Whispers of disease, dynasties, and downfall. For centuries, Britain's royals were draped in velvet and crowned with suspicion. Behind the portraits and parades lurked a rumor that would not die, that syphilis, the great pox, haunted the very heart of the monarchy. Tonight, we descend into the archives of scandal and speculation, where medicine blurs into metaphor and every king or queen carries a question mark. Were they truly afflicted or just cursed by gossip? The answers remain elusive, but the shadows are unforgettable. Before we dive headfirst into these royal enigmas, a quick pause. If you're drawn to stories where history and mystery collide, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the archives. And while you're here, let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Midnight, sunrise, somewhere in between? 1. Edward IV of England. History doesn't forget winners. It forgets their skin, their teeth, their smell. And if we're being honest, it often forgets their slow, twitching decline into death. Edward IV, Plantagenet king and poster boy for the War of the Roses, left behind victories, bastard children, and a mystery wrapped in decaying velvet. He was 40 when he died. Not old, even by 15th century standards. Certainly not old for a monarch who had survived multiple military campaigns, a rebellion, and whatever it meant to be married to Elizabeth Woodville, a woman the court accused of witchcraft and whose family never stopped stirring the pot. One day, Edward was king. The next, he was wrapped in cerecloth and buried in Windsor, cause of death listed vaguely as ague, a nice medieval word for fever, which might as well mean we have no idea. But in 2024, historians took another stab at it. According to Dr. Rebecca Salmon, the old narratives didn't quite add up. Ague may have been a polite fiction. What Salmon's team proposed was far more scandalous, and unfortunately far more plausible: syphilis. The French disease. The great pox. The rot beneath the crown. It was the small details that did it. Edward's increasingly sluggish movements, his bloated appearance, the records of severe pain in his limbs and joints, the possibility of ulcers, never detailed, but hinted at in letters from foreign ambassadors. In one, a Burgundian envoy describes the king as worn and ill to look upon, as if stricken in the soul. That might be poetry. Or it might be what passed for bedside gossip in 1470s Europe. There's no autopsy. There's no preserved skeleton with a convenient syphilitic lesion. What there is a pattern. Edward, once a towering warrior of 6'4", practically a giant in his day, was reduced in the last years to a recluse who could barely ride. His court masked the decline with proclamations about rheumatism and spiritual exhaustion. But spiritual exhaustion doesn't twist your spine and fog your mind. And if the disease wasn't in his blood, it was certainly in his court. The late 15th century was peak time for syphilis in Europe, just before it would explode in the early 1500s. The wars Edward fought weren't just about land or crowns. They were fought through brothels, between mistresses, in the margins of palace ledgers listing ointment for the king's night sweats. These entries, mundane, euphemistic, are almost more damning than a diagnosis. But here's the thing. If Edward did have syphilis, it wasn't a moral failing. It was a structural one. Power flowed through bedsheets as much as battlefields. Royal courts were less about governance than exposure to disease, to ambition, to anyone who had the right perfume and the wrong intentions. His death was quick, suspiciously so, and followed by one of the nastiest power vacuums in English history. Within months, his brother Richard had seized the throne. His sons, the famous princes in the Tower, had vanished. The Tudors would rise from this blood-soaked vacuum, branding the Yorks as decadent, diseased, and damned. It's almost too easy to imagine. A dying Edward IV, bedridden, ulcerated, hallucinating, and in walks Richard, younger, colder, calculating. Disease didn't just kill Edward. It cleared the path for a usurper. But even if you reject the syphilis theory, and many still do, you're left with a body that failed faster than expected, a court that lied reflexively, and a medical mystery that's never quite closed. The Tudors painted Edward as brutish. Later historians sanitized him as tragic. But maybe he was neither. Maybe he was just human. Mortal. Vulnerable to something crawling beneath the surface of royalty. The slow rot of secrets disguised as sickness. And in that rot, there's a kind of poetic justice. Edward was a king who won every battle, except the one inside his blood. Of course, he wasn't the only one. Some say the disease skipped a generation, hiding in the shadows of the Tudor dynasty. But by the time it reached the great colossus of English masculinity, Henry VIII himself, the rumors exploded into something worse than infection, a full-blown national obsession. 2. Henry VIII of England. There's something satisfying about imagining Henry VIII. Tyrant, romantic, executioner, Renaissance hype beast, being taken down by the very thing he feared the most, impotence. Not just in the political sense, in the anatomical one, and for centuries people whispered exactly that. Of all the British royals ever accused of syphilis, Henry VIII may be the most famous, and the most thoroughly misdiagnosed. In the popular imagination, he's practically the poster child for royal venereal disease. Bloated, paranoid about being bloated, discarding wives like spoiled meat. He killed 2, annulled 2, and drove 1 to die of childbirth, all while chasing the kind of legacy that could only be preserved in a painting, preferably one that didn't show his legs. It's easy to see how this myth caught fire. A man obsessed with heirs, suffering from open sores, foul temper, and creeping madness by the end of his life. Textbook syphilis, right? Except it isn't. Because despite the rumors, the reality of Henry's medical record tells a very different story. One full of bad genetics, worse doctors, and no trace, none, of syphilitic diagnosis, treatment, or outcome. Let's start with the smoking gun, mercury. For centuries, mercury was the go-to treatment for syphilis. Crude, ineffective, and poisonous, yes, but undeniably common. And if Henry had undergone such treatment, there would be records, receipts, apothecary notes, even Tudor-era whispers in court diaries. There are none. Not a single mention of mercury-based remedies in his long and well-documented medical history. What we do have are records of ulcers on his legs, chronic, painful, and oozing, which, to the untrained eye, might scream syphilis. But the ulcers were localized, not systemic. And crucially, they didn't come with the other signs you'd expect from a late-stage case. No neurological collapse, no loss of vision, no mental deterioration that couldn't be explained by his political paranoia or mounting failures. In fact, Henry remained mentally lucid, cruelly so, up to the very end. But the rumors didn't start in modern times. They began while Henry was still alive, fermented in Europe's chattering classes, spread by enemies who found the idea of a diseased tyrant deliciously poetic. The Catholic powers, already furious with Henry for divorcing Catherine of Aragon and launching the Anglican Church like a theological startup, didn't hesitate to paint him as both heretic and hypocrite. A man whose body bore the proof of divine punishment. The idea stuck. Not because it was true, but because it was useful. And like all good propaganda, it evolved. Victorian biographers, eager to cast moral judgment across centuries, revived the syphilis theory with moralistic flair. To them, It wasn't just likely that Henry had the disease. It was inevitable. After all, how else could they explain the sheer moral decay of his court? The promiscuity, the betrayal, the bloodshed? In the absence of psychology, they reached for pathology. But modern historians and medical experts have been less kind to the rumor. The Museum of Health debunked the theory comprehensively in 2024, citing not only the lack of symptoms, but the more likely alternative: metabolic syndrome. Henry, by the end of his life, was over 300 pounds, barely mobile, and suffering from type 2 diabetes and hypertension. Though they didn't have those names back then. His ulcers were venous, caused by poor circulation. His mental swings likely stemmed from chronic pain, isolation, and the existential crisis of being a king who had outlived his usefulness. And yet, the myth survives, because it's narratively satisfying. We like the idea that someone who ruined so many lives through lust and ego might have been undone by the very sins he embraced. We want Henry to have been punished, to have rotted from the inside out. We want the disease to be symbolic, but truth doesn't bend to narrative. If Henry VIII was diseased, it wasn't from syphilis. It was from power. He caught it early, somewhere between his first annulment and his second beheading. And by the time he died, his legacy had infected every corner of English politics, religion, and monarchy. So no, Henry VIII probably didn't have syphilis. What he had was worse. A completely healthy brain, fully aware of the ruin he left behind. A mind not clouded by disease, but sharpened by its absence. He knew what he was doing, and that makes his story all the more disturbing. But if the throne escaped this particular affliction in Henry's time, it didn't stay clean for long, because not far down the royal bloodline, another name appears, younger, stranger, and far more tragic. A man whose beautiful face and violent end would spark whispers of the great pox once again. Henry VIII may not have carried the great pox after all. But as you can see, rumors often outlive the truth. And speaking of stories that linger, if you're enjoying this journey through the shadows of royal history, make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss the next twist. While you're at it, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time of day is it in your corner of the world? 3. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He had the height of a prince, the face of a saint, and the judgment of a candle left burning too close to a tapestry. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, father to a future king of both England and Scotland, and a man whose royal blood ran dangerously close to madness, entered the court like a golden statue and left it like a ghost. Darnley's story begins with power, not the kind that's taken, but the kind that's inherited, and always slipping. He had a claim to both English and Scottish thrones, which made him attractive to Mary, who was herself wading through international plots, domestic rebellion, and the ever-present threat of Protestant insurrection. Their marriage was political, yes, but also emotional. Mary fell for him, or fell for the idea of him. And like most dangerous ideas, it didn't take long to rot. The rumors started not long after the wedding bells stopped echoing. Darnley grew sick, not just politically but physically. Letters from foreign diplomats note his sudden weight loss, his pallor, his tendency to disappear for days at a time. His behavior turned erratic. He drank excessively, insulted courtiers, and once tried to storm into Mary's chambers with a group of armed men. It would be easy to chalk this up to arrogance, or desperation, or the awkward adolescence of a 21-year-old nobleman unready for the role of consort. But others whispered something darker. Syphilis, or more politely in Tudor correspondence, a wasting illness, a pox, the prince's decline. In a court riddled with metaphor, disease was often the shadow cast by sin. Darnley had both. His enemies, and they were numerous, spread rumors of sexual indiscretions, of foreign trysts, of affairs both heterosexual and not. Pamphlets hinted at his corruptions of the body, while Catholic chroniclers who disliked his wavering religious loyalties hinted that God had marked him. Some modern historians point to an outbreak of smallpox in 1566, which Darnley is documented to have survived. That's the official explanation for his decline. A bout of smallpox that left him weakened, paranoid, and desperate for recognition. But there are a few problems with that theory. For one, no one else at court caught it. For another, the symptoms described don't line up with classic smallpox. There's mention of ulcerations, but none of the distinctive pockmarks, no scarring, no isolation protocols, no burning of linens or quarantining of rooms. All standard responses to smallpox outbreaks in the 16th century noble households. And then there's the timing. Darnley's illness came shortly after a string of diplomatic meetings with French and Italian envoys, during which he reportedly entertained himself beyond propriety, as one clerk euphemistically put it. When he returned, he was changed, not just in spirit but in flesh. If Darnley did contract syphilis, it would explain a lot. His sudden mood swings, his increasing paranoia, his belief that everyone at court, including his own wife, was plotting to kill him. His physical weakness, the lingering malaise that even rest and wealth couldn't shake. And then, of course, there's the suddenness of his death, or more accurately, the strangeness of it. Darnley was murdered in 1567, blown up in the garden of a house he'd been staying in under protection. Except, and this is the part that keeps historians up at night, he didn't die from the explosion. His body was found in the garden unburned. There were no blast injuries, just two corpses. Darnley and his servant both strangled. Why would someone go through the trouble of blowing up a house after the target had already been killed? It wasn't just murder, it was spectacle. Someone wanted it to look like rage, chaos, divine punishment. Theories range from Mary herself to the Earl of Bothwell, to Darnley's own political enemies within the Protestant factions. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't only about power. Maybe Darnley had become a liability, not because he was dangerous, but because he was dying. If he did have syphilis, and if his erratic behavior had begun attracting the wrong attention, removing him would have been both politically convenient and hygienically symbolic. In a world where illness could be used as a political cudgel, Darnley's body may have been more useful dead than alive. To this day, there's no definitive proof he had the disease. No medical record, no autopsy, no surviving tissue to test. But the rumors didn't die with him. They attached themselves to Mary. If Darnley was infected, then perhaps she was too. And if she wasn't, then why did she keep defending his legacy? The answers are as lost as Darnley's body, buried in a forgotten vault in Edinburgh. But the questions, they linger. Because when a golden prince fades into a fevered ghost, the court doesn't forget. It just shifts its gaze to the one left standing beside the grave. And in this case, it was Mary. Queen, widow, suspect, and possibly, if the whispers are true, the next royal touched by the shadow of the pox. 4. Mary, Queen of Scots. To understand Mary, Queen of Scots, you have to understand the curse of being beautiful in a world that doesn't forgive mistakes, especially not royal, Catholic, female ones. Her life reads like a Gothic opera ghost-written by her enemies, crowned at 6 days old, widowed at 18, imprisoned at 25, executed at 44. But somewhere in that grim timeline, a rumor began to circulate, soft at first, then louder, that Mary had been infected by syphilis. It wasn't about her, not directly. The accusation didn't start with her symptoms, or her physicians, or any record of illness in her long captivity. It started with her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the Golden Prince who darkened into scandal, and whose mysterious death left behind more smoke than fire. If Darnley was infected, and Mary shared his bed, then logic, or at least Tudor logic, followed that she was infected too. This is the origin of the syphilitic queen theory, not from diagnosis, but from implication. Guilt by association, disease by marital contact. The historical evidence? Thin. No primary source records any physician treating Mary for syphilis. There are no surviving letters from her household noting venereal conditions, a term that was often used in code among 16th century physicians. No exhumation reports, no posthumous medical analyses. In fact, by all accounts, Mary was in good health well into her 30s, even while under the stress of captivity, rebellion, and the erosion of her political legitimacy. So why did the rumor cling to her? Partly because it served a purpose. Mary was already politically radioactive. Her Catholicism threatened Elizabeth I. Her claim to the English throne made her a pawn in nearly every European conspiracy. And her choices, especially the catastrophic decision to marry Bothwell, a man widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's murder, gave her enemies all the material they needed. Once she was imprisoned in England, Elizabeth's ministers didn't just want her powerless, they wanted her discredited. Broken in the eyes of history, enter the pamphleteers. In a century that loved satire and slander almost as much as it loved scripture, printed attacks on Mary flooded the Protestant press. Some were subtle, focusing on her political alliances or supposed vanity. Others were not. They depicted her as lustful, unstable, morally corrupted. Diseased became a metaphor, and then, for some, a literal assumption. There's a chilling irony in all this. The more Mary was isolated, the more she was described as polluted, not just in body, but in soul. She became the scapegoat for everything Protestant England feared: foreign interference, female authority, Catholic conspiracy, and the unchecked passion of a monarch who didn't ask for permission before marrying, scheming, or grieving. And yet, through all this, Mary wrote. She left behind volumes of correspondence, poems, and official pleas to her cousin Elizabeth. Nowhere in those letters does she hint at illness beyond melancholy, headache, or despair. No mention of sores, no signs of madness, no decline in mental faculties, even in her final months. The Queen remained sharp, articulate, and tragically aware. She was executed in 1587, after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. Her final words, spoken in Latin, were a prayer, not a confession. If she had suffered from any chronic illness, especially one as disfiguring or mentally destructive as late-stage syphilis, it would have been noted. Her enemies would have written about it gleefully. They would have turned her decline into a morality play. But they didn't, because it wasn't there. And yet, the myth survives. Why? Perhaps because we need it to. Mary's story is too operatic, too drenched in betrayal and romance to leave untouched by scandal. She was too powerful to be merely tragic, and too tragic to be simply powerful. Adding disease to her biography makes her seem more human, more vulnerable. Or perhaps, to some, it justifies what was done to her. The imprisonment, the exile, the sword. But the reality is this. Mary was dangerous not because she was diseased, but because she wasn't. She had her health. She had her mind. And she had her name, Queen of Scots, which refused to die even as the English tried to bury it beneath decades of character assassination. In the end, Mary wasn't undone by infection. She was undone by narrative, which is perhaps the most contagious thing of all. Still, if Mary left behind no trace of syphilis in her blood, she may have left something more potent: a son. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, inherited her throne, her temperament, and perhaps, depending on whom you ask, her enemies' whispers. Because when it comes to royal bloodlines, rumors don't die. They just get inherited. 5. James VI and the First. He was born in a storm of scandal and raised by strangers. Crowned King of Scotland at 13 months old, James VI would eventually unite the thrones of England and Scotland, and in doing so, inherit not just 2 crowns, but centuries of superstition, surveillance, and suspicion. By the time he became James I of England, he was more than a monarch. He was a myth with legs that occasionally limped, but that's beside the point. For a king who wrote books about demonology and authorized the King James Bible, James was surprisingly unwell. Not dramatically, not poetically, but persistently. He suffered from a long list of ailments: arthritis, gout, kidney stones, migraines, tinnitus, trembling hands. None of them fatal, all of them annoying. It's the sort of resume you'd expect from someone who spent most of his adult life sitting in council chambers and being lied to. But as always with monarchs, the symptoms were only half the story. Whispers followed him. Not about his politics, though those were endlessly polarizing, but about his body, his fragility, his delicacy, his skin, his nerves, and, eventually, about whether he too had inherited something more sinister than 2 kingdoms. Syphilis, the great pox, not as a proven diagnosis, but as a persistent suspicion, a disease lurking beneath the lace ruffles and Latin proclamations. The actual evidence? Almost non-existent. James was known for his peculiar posture and a strangely halting gait, which some observers described as shuffling. His hands trembled so often that he rarely signed his own letters. He was also prone to fatigue, insomnia, and unexplained fevers. Enough to make 17th century court watchers squint and speculate, especially those with political motives. Add to this his famously close relationships with young male courtiers, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, chief among them, and the courtly gossip machine had everything it needed. In a culture that moralized illness and equated physical frailty with moral corruption, it was only a matter of time before someone added venereal affliction to the list of royal sins. It didn't help that syphilis was rampant in Europe during James's reign. The disease was no longer a rare, exotic punishment for soldiers and sailors. It was a public health crisis with aristocratic implications. Physicians were obsessed with it. Pamphlets fixated on it. Even plays used it as shorthand for decay and moral decline. And James, a king who ruled by divine right but struggled with public perception, made a tempting target. But when you dig into the records, the royal prescriptions, the ambassadorial reports, the correspondence of court physicians, the syphilis theory begins to crumble. There is no mention of mercury treatments, no signs of neurological breakdown, no documented rashes or lesions. In fact, James lived to 58, a perfectly respectable age for a monarch in the early 1600s, and remained mentally coherent, if increasingly paranoid and irritable, until the end. His ailments were real. But they appear to have been more mundane than scandalous. Arthritis? Absolutely. Kidney stones? Definitely. And extremely painful ones, judging by the frequency of treatments. But syphilis? That seems to have been a shadow projected onto him by satirists and enemies, eager to undermine his authority with a suggestion too scandalous to prove and too delicious to ignore. It's worth noting that James himself was obsessed with disease. He issued public health edicts, fled cities at the first sign of plague, and demanded rigorous cleanliness from his household staff. He even claimed that he could smell when someone was ill. Whether that was hypochondria or just excellent political instinct is up for debate, but it suggests a man deeply aware of how disease could be both a literal and symbolic threat to his sovereignty. James was also an image-conscious king. Despite his physical insecurities, he was acutely aware of how he was perceived, both at home and abroad. He knew that frailty, especially of the body, could be weaponized against him. And so he masked it with words, with theology, with policy, with pageantry. If his hands shook, his decrees didn't. If his legs stumbled, his prose stood firm. So no, James VI and the First almost certainly did not have syphilis. But the fact that we're still asking the question says something about monarchy itself. About how we map moral meaning onto medical mystery. About how we want kings, especially complex ones, to be tragic, flawed, diseased, especially when their flaws mirror our fears. Because if James was sick, then his kingdom was too. If he trembled, maybe the empire trembled with him. And if there was rot in the king's bones, even if imagined, then maybe that explained why things never quite held together after he was gone. And when he was gone, he left a son. One who believed in divine right with almost suicidal devotion. A king who would not bend and would eventually break. Charles I. Whispers of pox would follow him too. As always, they never arrived with proof. Only smoke, only speculation, only the scent of something rotting just behind the crown. 6. Charles I. Charles I didn't look like a man destined to be torn apart by his own kingdom. Small, quiet, sickly as a child. He wasn't even supposed to be king. But fate, much like monarchy, doesn't always reward the prepared. It rewards the survivor. And when his older brother Henry died of typhoid in 1612, Charles stepped forward, stiff-necked, soft-voiced, and curiously fragile for someone who would later plunge his nation into civil war. And like most rulers caught between divine right and public opinion, he came with rumors. Some about his politics, some about his faith, and some, predictably, about his body. Syphilis, they said. Not as a certainty, not as a diagnosis, but as an accusation whispered by pamphleteers, foreign diplomats, and enemies with printing presses and sharp tongues. Of course, there's no hard evidence, not in the strict sense. No royal physicians left behind notes saying, "The king is poxed." No diaries confessing sudden madness, no secret treatments logged in royal ledgers. But in the court of public perception, Charles had all the wrong symptoms. He was pale, withdrawn, subject to occasional tremors. He had what contemporaries described as melancholic humors, 17th century shorthand for long silences, black moods, and bouts of self-isolation. He was obsessed with control. Every button, every sermon, every clause in every treaty had to be exactly right. And yet the tighter he gripped the reins, the more everything around him unraveled. He also had a tendency to appear not quite well at crucial public moments. In 1633, during his Scottish coronation, a ceremony designed to reinforce legitimacy, he looked visibly fatigued and refused to eat publicly. Courtiers whispered that he had taken ill, though the official word was that he was touched by the weather. A convenient diagnosis, especially in Scotland. By the time civil war broke out in 1642, Charles had become a deeply polarizing figure. To royalists, he was a holy martyr. To parliamentarians, he was the embodiment of corruption, not just political, but physical. Satirical broadsheets depicted him as deformed, poisoned, consumed by internal filth. Some went further, implying venereal disease as a metaphor for his moral decay. Syphilis became a symbol, not a symptom. A way to explain his stubbornness, his isolation, his alleged detachment from reality. This wasn't just gossip, it was political strategy. Because in the 17th century, to accuse a king of disease was to accuse him of failure. The body of the monarch represented the body politic. If the king was infected, so was the state. And if the king could not be cured, neither could the nation, except perhaps by cutting off the head. Still, the actual medical records that survive tell a different story. Charles was reasonably healthy for most of his life. He fathered 9 children, rode horses well into his 40s, and maintained a steady, if rigid, mind. He did suffer from digestive problems and joint pain. But so did most nobles who spent their lives eating salted meats and sitting through 4-hour council meetings. His court physician, Sir Theodore de Mayerne, left detailed notes on Charles's diet and habits. None of them point to syphilis, no mercury, no cauterization, no mentions of ulcers, lesions, or mental collapse. What they do reveal is something more subtle. A man under extraordinary psychological strain. A man who believed, genuinely, catastrophically, that kingship was sacred, indivisible, and non-negotiable. And like many men who refused to bend, Charles eventually snapped. Not physically, politically. His trial in 1649 was a spectacle, not just because it was the first time an English king had been put on trial by his own subjects, but because of how he behaved. Calm, precise, detached. He spoke not like a dying man, but like a man already martyred. There were no signs of disease, no shakes, no lapses in memory. If anything, he looked healthier than some of the judges sent to condemn him. He died on the scaffold, clean-shaven, straight-backed, unapologetic. And in that moment, the rumors about his body were overshadowed by the reality of his death. The cut that severed not just a head, but a dynasty. But even in death, the whispers continued. Because while Charles's body lay in a coffin, England entered a decade of political experimentation, religious paranoia, and ultimately, restoration. And when the monarchy returned in 1660, it didn't come back purified. It came back covered in perfume, powdered wigs, and the same old rumors. Only now, with even more velvet. The Restoration was a time of indulgence, laughter, masks, masquerades. But behind the silks and silences, the old disease re-emerged, not in policy, but in flesh. Because the next king, Charles's son, would carry his name and his crown, but perhaps not his restraint. And the court of Charles II would become the most openly decadent in British history. And with it came mistresses, scandal, and yes, more whispers of the great pox. 7. Henrietta Maria. To some, she was a queen. To others, a foreign infection in silk. Henrietta Maria of France, wife of Charles I, was never just a consort. She was a symbol, one that meant different things depending on which side of the Reformation you happened to be on. To English Protestants, she was a Catholic threat. To European Catholics, she was a political foothold. And to the public, she was scandal made flesh. Accusations followed her across borders. Papist, sorceress, corrupter. But among the ugliest and strangest was the whisper that she had brought something else into England. Syphilis. It wasn't shouted. It never is at first. But it crept through pamphlets, scrawled in metaphors, buried in satire. Some said she arrived with French affections, a wink to both her nationality and her suspected diseases. Others called her the unclean dove, poetic shorthand for a queen suspected of carrying more than just rosary beads in her baggage. Let's be clear, there is no credible medical evidence that Henrietta Maria ever suffered from syphilis. She lived into her 60s, well beyond the average lifespan for 17th century European nobility. She bore 9 children, survived the English Civil War, and endured 2 decades of exile. No letters from her personal physicians, no eyewitness accounts from courtiers, no suggestive treatments like mercury baths or isolation chambers appear in the record. So where did the rumor come from? Blame the politics. England in the 1640s wasn't just fracturing, it was actively consuming itself. The monarchy was increasingly unpopular, Parliament was armed and increasingly bold, and the public was hungry for an enemy they could blame for the slow collapse of order. Henrietta, being French, Catholic, and female, was the perfect scapegoat. She was said to be the hidden hand behind her husband's stubbornness. A shadow advisor in lace gloves, whispering foreign ideas into Charles I's ear. She imported Catholic priests. She built a private chapel. She corresponded with Rome. And, perhaps most symbolically damning of all, she brought a small army of French courtiers with her, an entourage the English found both effeminate and suspicious. The idea that she also carried venereal disease was, in this light, not a medical diagnosis but a metaphor. She was cast as a foreign contagion, not in the sense of illness, but in the sense of moral and political corruption. To the Puritan writers and parliamentarian propagandists, syphilis stood in for everything they believed Henrietta represented: decadence, secrecy, perversion of Protestant purity. And in the media landscape of the time, if you could call ballads and pamphlets media, that metaphor got literalized. Illustrated broadsides depicted the Queen in various monstrous forms, with boils, with leprous skin, with insect swarms trailing her. One particularly infamous engraving, printed in 1643, showed her seated atop a dying English lion, handing out rosaries to children while a plague cloud loomed above. The text was careful to avoid explicit accusations. But the implication was clear. It wasn't just about her body. It was about what her body symbolized. Henrietta became the embodiment of England's fear of Catholic infiltration, and that fear needed to be justified. Disease was a convenient explanation. If England was sick, then surely it had caught something, or someone, foul. But the real Henrietta Maria wasn't rotting from the inside. She was strategizing, negotiating with foreign courts, writing letters, fundraising armies, smuggling royalist messages. When the Civil War escalated and Charles lost his grip on power, she fled to France, not as a diseased exile, but as a diplomat in velvet armor. And yet, the rumors stuck. They always do. Even after Charles's execution, even after her eventual return to England in the early 1660s, older, thinner, but still politically shrewd, the stain remained. Her critics never apologized. No pamphlets were retracted. History doesn't wash its hands so easily. What's fascinating is how Henrietta outlived the gossip. She saw her son restored to the throne. She watched the monarchy rebuild itself, brick by whispered brick. And she died peacefully in a French convent, surrounded by portraits of saints and her own grandchildren. Not the tragic, decaying figure the pamphlets warned of, just a queen, forgotten by many, misunderstood by more. So no, Henrietta Maria did not suffer from syphilis, but the idea that she might have says more about England than about her. It reveals how disease can be weaponized, not to describe reality, but to distort it. How gossip becomes policy, how fiction corrodes fact. And in the court that followed her, one ruled by her son, Charles II, those distortions only became more theatrical. Because if Henrietta was accused of bringing infection into England, her son was accused of spreading it with gusto. And in his court, the rumors wouldn't be metaphor. They'd be dressed in wigs, drenched in perfume, and whispered across dozens of beds. 8. Charles II of England. If Charles I died for his crown, Charles II lived for it, extravagantly, unapologetically, and in full theatrical technicolor. His reign was dubbed the Restoration, and restore he did. The monarchy, the theaters, the taverns, the scandals, and most of all, the king's right to behave like a man who knew death intimately and had decided to keep it waiting with champagne and courtiers. But with the Restoration came whispers, and with whispers came accusations. As always, syphilis surfaced, not as a confirmed affliction, but as a hovering suspicion, the kind of rumor that slips through velvet corridors and sticks to everything it touches. After all, Charles's lifestyle didn't just flirt with scandal, it moved in with it. He had mistresses, many and very publicly. Nell Gwynn, Barbara Palmer, Louise de Querouaille, Hortense Mancini, among others. He fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children. His court was less a royal institution and more a stage show with political consequences. The king, painted with flowing wigs and bedroom eyes, was said to be tireless, indulgent, and a little too eager to avoid the company of his own wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza. So when the rumors came, they landed easily. The idea that Charles II might have contracted syphilis wasn't born from a symptom. It was born from a lifestyle. The logic was seductive. How could someone live like that and not get infected? And yet, despite the convenient narrative, the historical record provides no confirmation. Yes, Charles suffered from ailments, headaches, digestive troubles, occasional fevers, but none of the classic markers of syphilis ever appeared. No neurological deterioration, no rash, no signs of mercury treatment, which by the 17th century had become standard, if horrific, protocol for venereal disease. His physicians, some of the most documented and letter-happy men of their time, never mentioned it. And Charles himself, who joked openly about everything from his parliament to his paramours, never hinted at illness beyond the usual royal inconveniences. More interesting, perhaps, is the timing of the rumors. They gained traction not during his life, when he might have sued or scoffed or thrown someone in the tower, but after his death. That's when the stories bloomed. In 1685, Charles fell ill after a sudden and violent seizure. He lingered for several days, semi-conscious, slipping in and out of coherence. His physicians, in a flurry of panic, tried everything: bleeding, blistering, purging, enemas, herbal concoctions, even powdered human skull. None of it worked. He died at the age of 54. The cause of death? Modern analysis suggests chronic kidney disease, possibly brought on by years of hypertension or high mercury exposure from previous non-syphilitic treatments. But as always, the lack of clarity opened the door. And into that door walked the gossips. Syphilis, some declared. Divine. Punishment, others whispered. After all, wasn't this the king who flaunted sin? Who laughed in the face of Puritan restraint? Who publicly endorsed religious tolerance while privately dodging any kind of marital fidelity? To critics, Charles's alleged affliction became proof of the moral decay they had always claimed clung to his reign. The disease was never about his body. It was about his symbolism. In their eyes, he didn't just rule England, he corrupted it. But again, no evidence supports the diagnosis. In fact, by contemporary standards, Charles was one of the more resilient kings physically. He governed through plague, fire, war, and scandal, all while maintaining a sharp intellect and a famously dry wit. His official correspondence remained articulate until the very end. No delusions, no dementia. Just a man whose body gave out after a lifetime of rich food, poor medicine, and political stress. Still, the myth of his infection persists. And it persists because it feels narratively perfect. The decadent king undone by his own decadence. The libertine punished by the very pleasures he refused to renounce. It's not medical history. It's moral theater. And perhaps that's what makes Charles II so fascinating. He wasn't tragic in the way his father had been. He wasn't saintly or tortured or pious. He was practical. He understood that being king meant being mythologized, often against your will. So he leaned into it, played the part, laughed along. And maybe that's why the rumors didn't need to be true, because the performance was convincing enough. Still, if Charles managed to dance just outside the reach of infection, or at least the public recognition of it, his brother would not be so lucky. When James II took the throne, he inherited not just a kingdom, but a shadow. One that would follow him into exile, etched into the ink of Restoration satire and burned into the memory of a monarchy that had learned to fear both rebellion and rumors. 9. James II of England. By the time James II ascended the throne in 1685, the English monarchy had learned to expect two things from its kings: scandal, and suspicion. His older brother Charles II had provided both in abundance, wrapped in silk and laughter. James brought a different energy entirely, rigid, unforgiving, Catholic, and, if the satirist were to be believed, possibly diseased. The rumors didn't start with James's policies. They started with his body, or, more precisely, with how that body looked under pressure. His complexion, his stiffness, the sudden changes in his appearance. A courtier wrote that he had a certain bloom, then a sudden fade. Another noted his frequent absences for illness, unnamed. And so the whispers followed, as they always do in palaces with long corridors. Syphilis, the great pox, the royal rot. It wasn't a diagnosis. It was a hypothesis, and a politically motivated one at that. James's real affliction, at least in the eyes of Parliament and much of Protestant England, wasn't medical. It was theological. A Catholic king on a Protestant throne, an unapologetic convert in a country that had long since burned its ties to Rome. For many, that alone was proof of corruption. His faith was seen not as devotion, but as contamination, and contamination needed symbols. Syphilis was one. The evidence? Again, as with so many of these royal figures, it's almost entirely circumstantial. James was known to suffer from periodic bouts of illness, fatigue, leg pain, skin irritation. Nothing dramatic, nothing documented with certainty, but enough to fuel speculation. He also had a short temper, a flair for paranoia, and a love of secrecy. All qualities that, to his critics, hinted at something festering behind the mask of divine right. Satirical pamphlets, the primary weapons of public opinion at the time, painted James in grotesque terms. In one notorious 1687 print, he's shown holding a rosary in one hand and scratching his leg with the other, sores exaggerated and eyes sunken. In another, he's depicted as a fox-faced figure whose touch corrupts the throne itself. The disease isn't the point. The point is what it represents. Weakness, unfitness, the creeping suggestion that the king's body mirrors the kingdom's decay. And as usual, none of it sticks in the medical record. James had a long life for a man of his era. He lived to 67, a respectable age, especially for a monarch who spent much of his later years in exile. He fathered numerous children, was capable of long diplomatic engagements, and remained mentally lucid throughout his reign and beyond. There's no record of mercury treatments, no mention of cognitive decline, no notes of the physical deformities often associated with untreated syphilis. If he was ill, he was functional, and in monarchy, function often trumps diagnosis. Still, the timing of the rumors mattered. England was on the edge. Again, the glorious Revolution was already a whisper in Protestant drawing rooms. William of Orange was already casting glances across the channel. And James, in the eyes of many, had to be discredited before he could be dethroned. Disease made that easier. A king with sores is easier to mock than a king with soldiers. A king with a rotting body makes a better metaphor than a king with a complex political strategy. In the end, James wasn't defeated by illness. He was defeated by momentum. When William landed in 1688, the army that was supposed to defend James melted away with hardly a fight. Not because he was sick, but because the story of him being sick had become more powerful than the truth. The narrative once again won. He fled to France, where he lived out the rest of his life in relative dignity, praying, writing, trying to organize a comeback that would never come. He died in 1701 at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, surrounded not by scandal but by routine. His body showed signs of age, not infection. His mind remained sharp. He left behind legacies, not lesions. But the whispers survived. In the decades that followed, Jacobite loyalists tried to sanctify his memory. while Whig historians tried to dismember it. Both sides played with the idea of disease, either as martyrdom or moral failing. The syphilis rumor, never confirmed, became part of the permanent speculative canon, and in this, James was hardly unique, because for every king who ruled with a crown, there was another who ruled through rumor. And in the world of Restoration England, where satire could dethrone as easily as gunpowder, nothing was more potent than the suggestion that your king was rotting beneath his robes. The irony? The next name on the list wasn't known for indulgence or cruelty. She was known for piety, for order, for calm. But when she died young and childless, the whispers came anyway. Because in royal courts, even queens aren't immune from the shadows, especially not when those shadows look like syphilis. 10. Mary II. She ruled during the glorious part of the Revolution, quietly, dutifully, and with all the public grace that 17th century England demanded from a Protestant queen. Mary II, daughter of the deposed James II and co-ruler with her husband William of Orange, was meant to represent everything her father didn't: health, purity, English values, whatever those were supposed to mean in a century still recovering from plague, fire, civil war, and divine right theology. But Mary, for all her dignity and apparent virtue, didn't survive long. She died in 1694 at the age of just 32. Officially? Smallpox. Unofficially? Well, that's where the rumors started, as they always do, in the gaps, the silences, the things left too politely unspoken in court bulletins. Because her death wasn't just premature, it was disruptive. And in politics, a death that comes too early always invites more questions than answers. The symptoms were dramatic: sudden fever, fatigue, then blotching, a rash, a burning of the skin. Smallpox, they said. And indeed it was a common diagnosis at the time. The disease was rampant in London, but even in its ubiquity it left behind a trail of debate. For some, the diagnosis felt too neat, too convenient, especially given the secrecy that immediately followed her death. There was no public display of the body, a sharp deviation from royal tradition. The funeral was delayed. Physicians were unusually silent, and in the halls of Parliament murmurs grew louder. Was it really smallpox? Or was it something else? Enter syphilis. Again. This time the rumors were subtle. They didn't accuse her directly. Instead, they questioned the origins of her illness. They questioned her husband. They questioned the quietness with which the whole affair had been handled. And they did it all with that uniquely 17th century gift for euphemism: fever of uncertain origin, blotches inconsistent with common pox, symptoms of a wasting nature. There was no evidence, but there was opportunity. Mary had married William of Orange not for love, but for politics. Their union was engineered to prevent another Catholic dynasty. William, stern and ascetic, was her cousin, her co-sovereign, and, by most accounts, not particularly affectionate. There were rumors about his own preferences, but those were always carefully deflected. Still, their marriage, while civil, was largely childless. Miscarriages, perhaps, or infertility, or, as some whispered in coffee houses and scribbled in the margins of political satire, something contagious. If syphilis had entered the royal bedroom, who brought it in? Mary, the devout daughter of a once Catholic king? Or William, the austere Calvinist war leader whose military campaigns often kept him abroad and far from the Queen's side? The answer, of course, is that there is no answer. Because the question itself was never about medicine. It was about narrative. In an era obsessed with morality plays, disease was more than biology. It was judgment. If Mary died young, it had to mean something. A lesson, a punishment, a revelation. But modern historians are, predictably, less interested in allegory, and what they've found doesn't support the syphilis theory. Her physicians described high fever, pustular eruptions, and eventual organ failure, symptoms more aligned with virulent smallpox than with venereal disease. There are no notes of mental decline, no records of mercury treatment, no mention of secondary stage lesions or neurological impairment. The king himself was reportedly devastated by her death. Not a man pretending to grieve a woman already estranged by scandal or sickness. So why did the rumor survive? Partly because Mary's death left such a gaping absence. She had no children, no successor, no dramatic final act. She simply faded, abruptly, in the middle of winter. And in politics, a clean death is never satisfying. People needed a story, a scandal, a trace of sin in the saint. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was because of who she was, a woman in power. Even sharing it with her husband, Mary was still a queen in her own right. And powerful women, especially those who appear too perfect, tend to attract blemishes. If not on their skin, then on their legacy. So no, Mary II likely never suffered from syphilis. But her brief reign, clean, efficient, quietly devout, wasn't immune to the cultural infections of her time. Rumor, suspicion, the need to explain early death with something more than bad luck or bad air. And as always, when the queen fell, attention shifted to the man left behind. William III, cold, reclusive, more comfortable on the battlefield than the ballroom, would rule alone. And while his enemies couldn't quite accuse him of passion, they would accuse him of something worse: hiding. Behind theology, behind silence. And according to some, behind the suspicious veil of a royal disease that seemed to follow the crown like a curse. 11. William III. William III was a king who never quite fit the role, even as he performed it with ruthless efficiency. He wasn't born to rule England. He was born in The Hague, a Dutch Protestant champion raised for war and reformation, not ceremony and tradition. When he landed in England in 1688, invited, mind you, by English Protestants eager to depose his father-in-law, he brought with him not a royal glow but a chill. The kind that drifts in through a palace window and never quite leaves. Where Charles II had been velvet and vice, and James II a stubborn firebrand, William III was ice, reserved, sharp, and politically brutal. But behind that frosty exterior, rumors once again began to thaw and drip. The question wasn't if William had enemies, he had plenty, but what they would accuse him of. And eventually they landed on a familiar target: syphilis. As usual, it wasn't about medicine, it was about meaning. The accusations against William weren't widespread during his early years. He was, after all, a Protestant savior, the man who restored balance, or at least Protestant dominance, in the kingdom. But the public is a fickle thing, especially when it's trying to understand a monarch who rarely smiled, walked with difficulty, and kept his personal life tightly sealed. Over time, those observations crystallized into speculation. The king was thin. He had a perpetual cough. He suffered from asthma, dropsy, fluid retention, and recurring fevers. His face was described as pale and drawn, his body slight and seemingly in decline even in his 40s. Add to this the fact that he had no surviving children and a wife who died young, and the ingredients were there. The pot just needed stirring. Political cartoons began to depict him as fragile, sickly, almost waxen. His enemies, particularly Jacobite supporters who wanted to restore James II's line, took advantage. They cast him as a puppet king, barely held together, masking disease with power. Some whispered that he had brought more than soldiers and Protestantism from the continent. He had brought the French disease. It was ironic, considering he was the one supposedly saving England from foreign corruption. The pamphlets didn't need proof. They never do. All they needed was suggestion. That he walked with a stoop. That he winced during court appearances. That his temper was short and his appearances increasingly rare. By the late 1690s, some were referring to him as the Poxed Dutchman, a title both xenophobic and clinically speculative. And yet, the records tell a more grounded story. William III suffered from lifelong asthma, which worsened significantly during England's damp winters. His persistent cough and wheezing were noted from his youth and often treated with opiates, herbs, and the usual barrage of ineffective 17th-century remedies. His thin frame wasn't the result of wasting disease, but chronic illness and the natural build of someone bred more for horseback than for courtly displays. He also suffered a significant injury in 1702, a broken collarbone caused by a fall from his horse. It was this injury, complicated by pneumonia, that ultimately killed him. Not madness, not decay, certainly not tertiary stage syphilis. His personal physicians, including Dr. Hans Sloane, one of the most reputable doctors in London, left detailed notes about his decline. Nowhere is syphilis mentioned. There's no evidence of mercury treatment, no signs of disfigurement, no records of neurological impairment. His mind remained intact, his speech clear, his judgment as cold and calculated as ever. So why did the rumor persist? Because William III didn't perform monarchy the way people expected. He wasn't warm, he wasn't theatrical. He rarely addressed crowds or played to the gallery. He ruled through advisors, ministers, and military command. His private life was exactly that. Private. And in a court obsessed with visibility, privacy often looked like guilt. His childlessness, too, became a point of focus. With Mary II dead and no heir in sight, the dynasty he and Parliament had gone to great lengths to secure was suddenly fragile again. The succession crisis stirred public anxiety, and where there is royal anxiety, there is often medical speculation. If the king had no children, was it by choice, by tragedy, or by something unspoken? As always, the question outlived the man. William died in 1702 quietly, surrounded by statesmen rather than sentiment. He left behind a throne that passed not to a child but to a cousin, Anne, another queen whose body would be scrutinized as deeply as her politics. And with William's death, the rumor didn't vanish. It lingered. Because monarchy isn't just hereditary. Its diseases are too, if not through blood, then through belief. So no, William III probably never had syphilis. But like the monarchs before him, he inherited its shadow. A shadow that darkened thrones, distorted legacies, and refused to die. And as England turned once more to a woman for stability, Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, the rumors simply changed shape. This time, they whispered not about lovers or mistresses, but about wombs, about children who never lived, about a curse passed down, not through lust, but through lineage. 12. Anne of Great Britain. They called her Good Queen Anne, though the title seemed more out of politeness than praise. In truth, Anne of Great Britain was not especially good or bad, but tired. Perpetually, cosmically tired. She ruled for 12 complicated years, overseeing the Act of Union in 1707 and watching England and Scotland dissolve into Great Britain on her watch. She did it all from behind drawn curtains, often confined to bed, surrounded by medicines, murmuring doctors, and the heavy silence of rooms built for heirs who never arrived. 19 pregnancies. That is the number most often recited in tones of historical horror, pity, or disbelief. Out of those 19, only one child, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy. He died at age 11. The rest were miscarriages, stillbirths, or short-lived infants, who were named, christened, and then buried before the ink was dry on the announcements. And so, the question arose, what was wrong with Queen Anne? To some, the answer was tragic biology. To others, it was divine punishment. And to a certain vocal segment of 18th century pamphleteers and political gossips, the answer was, predictably, Syphilis. The theory was simple and salacious. Anne was either infected herself or she had inherited something from one of her parents, a curse in the bloodstream. It was whispered in coffee houses, scribbled in the margins of newspapers, murmured in foreign courts where every English misfortune was seen as a Protestant omen. A woman with that many failed pregnancies couldn't just be unlucky. Something had to be wrong, something shameful, something poetic. But like most royal rumors, this one was built on a scaffold of assumptions and shadows. Let's begin with the basics. Anne's medical history was abysmal by any standard. She suffered from chronic gout, which left her unable to walk in her later years. She ballooned in weight, likely due to both her sedentary condition and treatments that involved generous helpings of brandy and laudanum. Her eyesight deteriorated. Her mood fluctuated. She had headaches, fevers, stomach issues. At times, she could barely move without assistance. At others, she was sharp, clever, even biting in her wit. What she did not display, however, were the classic signs of late-stage syphilis. There were no reports of disfigurement, no dementia, no hallucinations or tremors, no mercurial treatments in her physician's logs, which, for the record, are extensive. Her personal doctors, particularly Dr. Hans Sloane, yes, the same who treated William III, kept obsessive records of her ailments. Not once is syphilis suggested even in passing. And yet, the theory persists. Why? Partly because Anne was a woman, and women in power, particularly those who struggled with fertility, were historically subject to levels of bodily scrutiny that bordered on the fanatical. Her inability to produce a living heir was not seen as a private grief, but a national emergency. And as the last monarch of the House of Stuart, her failure was interpreted as dynastic. Final. Possibly cursed. More intriguingly, some modern theorists have looked back and suggested that Anne may have suffered from an autoimmune disorder, likely systemic lupus or antiphospholipid syndrome, both of which are known today to cause chronic inflammation, joint pain, and repeated miscarriages. But 18th century medicine had no such language. In the absence of scientific explanation, people reached for the nearest metaphor: disease, scene, decay. And so, the rumor took hold. There's also the matter of her marriage. Prince George of Denmark, her husband, was famously dull. Loyal, yes, but uninspiring. Some whispered that he may have been the source of the trouble. Others flipped the accusation back to Anne, pointing to her close, some said too close, relationship with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. That friendship ended in acrimony and a flurry of bitter letters, but not before it had been painted with every kind of insinuation. Was syphilis a real part of Anne's life? Probably not. But was it part of how people explained her? Absolutely, because the body of a monarch was never just a body. It was a canvas, a mirror, a tool. And when it failed, especially in the task of producing heirs, it had to be marked with something more than biology. It had to be marked with shame. Anne died in 1714, bloated, exhausted, and without a single living child. Her body gave out in pieces, her kidneys, her heart, her limbs. But her mind? It endured to the end. She knew she had failed in the one task she was most expected to complete. But she also knew, perhaps more clearly than any king before her, that sometimes the throne itself is the illness, and with her death, the Stuart line ended. But the rumors didn't, because the next monarch would not be English, or Scottish, or even well-liked. He would be German, a stranger, and his arrival would bring with it a whole new era of gossip, and once again, the murmur that somewhere, behind the powdered wigs and stiff uniforms, the great pox might be whispering still. 13. George I of Great Britain. George I didn't speak English. Not fluently, anyway. He rarely smiled in public, barely tolerated ceremony, and seemed permanently annoyed to be king of anything. In the long, confusing bloodline tangle left by Queen Anne's childless reign, George Ludwig of Hanover was the nearest Protestant heir, even if that nearness came with a passport, a thick German accent, and a complete lack of interest in British pageantry. When he took the throne in 1714, it wasn't with fanfare. It was with shrugs, from both sides. George wasn't loved, but he was tolerated. And tolerance in monarchy is just another word for suspicion waiting to bloom. His reign, though politically stable in the hands of Parliament, was socially uneasy. He was foreign, aloof, and, as always with foreign royals parachuted into Britain, a tempting canvas for rumor. And behind the political satire and xenophobic caricatures, one particular accusation kept cropping up, flickering in the corners of court gossip and satirical pamphlets. The king had syphilis. Not confirmed. Never confirmed. But whispered, with just enough certainty to stain. It started with his private life. Or more precisely, the fact that it had once been scandalously public. Long before he was king, George had married Sophia Dorothea of Celli. The marriage was political, arranged, and, almost immediately, a disaster. Sophia was accused of having an affair with a Swedish count. George responded not with divorce, but with permanent exile. He locked her away in a remote castle in Alden for the rest of her life. She would never see her children again. George never remarried. This naturally invited speculation. Why exile your wife, then never seek a replacement? Was it piety, spite, or was there something else? Some secret that made remarriage impossible, or unnecessary? Enter the rumor. In the decades that followed as George transitioned from Elector of Hanover to King of Great Britain, satirists began connecting the dots. His ongoing bachelorhood, his physical stiffness, his increasingly haggard appearance, a fondness for mistresses, yes, but also a notable lack of warmth in any of his relationships. Some suggested he was emotionally hollow. Others went further. Perhaps he was physically compromised. Perhaps there was a reason he avoided intimacy outside of his long-standing mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg, who followed him to England and was given the very British title of Duchess of Kendal. But Melusine's presence didn't stop the rumors. It fueled them. The idea was that she knew, that she protected him, or managed him, that their relationship was less romantic than strategic, and that perhaps, behind the heavy court etiquette and German precision, there was a medical secret being quietly managed by courtiers and doctors alike. And yet, as ever, the facts are less theatrical. George III lived to the age of 67. He was active in governance, particularly during the earlier years of his reign. He traveled frequently between England and Hanover, sometimes spending more time in the latter than the former. He had no documented episodes of madness, no physical disfigurements recorded by courtiers or ambassadors. His correspondence, though terse, remained coherent and formal throughout his life. And there is no record, none, of mercury treatments, isolation, or the neurological decline typically associated with advanced syphilis. When he died in 1727, it was sudden but not suspicious. While journeying back to Hanover, he suffered a stroke, or what doctors of the time called an apoplexy. He collapsed and died en route, never regaining consciousness. The death, though abrupt, was not described in terms of degeneration. There were no signs of long-term wasting disease, no foreshadowing of collapse. Just a man whose body gave out after a lifetime of political stress and transcontinental travel. Still, the rumors stuck. Why? Because George I never gave the English people what they craved: connection. He was never their monarch emotionally. He ruled like an accountant, efficient, distant, allergic to sentiment. And so they imagined things, invented stories, gave him diseases he likely never had to fill the space where affection should have gone. In the coffee houses of London, they joked that the king was rotting. In political cartoons, he was drawn with sunken cheeks and trembling hands. Even after his death, some claimed that his heart had failed because it was so long frozen. Was it syphilis? Highly unlikely. But monarchy, once again, was about more than health. It was about performance. George I never bothered to perform, and so the public wrote their own script. His son George II would inherit the throne and a few of the same accusations. After all, he looked like his father. He ruled like him too, cold, controlled, and more interested in power than perception. And for a British public that couldn't seem to stop diagnosing its kings with invisible diseases, that was more than enough to bring the rumor back. 14. George II of Great Britain. George II was a king with a temper problem, a military complex, and the charisma of a barometer. Not that it mattered. He didn't need to charm anyone. He needed to survive. In a monarchy slowly being hemmed in by Parliament, power was no longer about who shouted loudest, but who lasted longest. George II, despite his rigid face and even more rigid personality, managed to reign for 33 years. An impressive feat for a man so frequently described as ill-tempered, sour, and not as clever as he thinks. If his father, George I, was an aloof foreigner who kept England at arm's length, George II was more like a landlord with a bad attitude, technically in charge, deeply resented, and constantly threatening to raise the metaphorical rent. He inherited not just the throne, but the cultural suspicions that came with being Hanoverian. German, stiff, foreign in accent and manner even decades into rule. And with those suspicions came the usual ghost, disease. Whispers of syphilis floated around George II in much the same way they had for his father, faintly, satirically, but persistently. He was mocked in the pamphlet press as being decayed in the flesh, unfit for love or war, and troubled with nocturnal afflictions. These weren't just poetic jabs at his age or his gout. They were hints, suggestions, nods toward the old, reliable accusation that something deeper was wrong with the king, something rotting, something secret. The source? As usual, it was a mixture of political frustration and personal speculation. George was not beloved. He clashed with his ministers, quarreled with his son Frederick, and rarely engaged the public unless it was to ride out and be seen on a horse. He did fight at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, the last British monarch to personally lead troops in battle, and for that he earned a grudging kind of respect. But not affection. And where affection fails, satire creeps in. The accusations were rarely direct. This wasn't a court-era diagnosis. It was gossip weaponized by implication. In Restoration fashion, poets and pamphleteers accused him of the pox of pride, or of carrying the German condition, a term that had already become backhandedly synonymous with venereal disease. It was more slur than symptom. But what evidence did they have? None, really. At least, not medical evidence. George II had his health problems, certainly. He suffered from severe bouts of gout, a common affliction among royalty who dined on too much meat and wine and not enough leafy greens. He was described as being racked with stiffness in his later years, often grumbling about his joints and needing assistance to walk during winter. His digestion was also poor, chronic constipation, indigestion, and what one physician called melancholic bloating. But these are hardly rare or mysterious symptoms in an aging monarch. And notably, his mental faculties remained strong. He was detail-obsessed, grudge-holding, sharp-tongued. He continued to correspond with ministers, review military reports, and even plan palace renovations into his late 60s. There were no public lapses in coherence, no signs of dementia, delusions, or neurological decay, all hallmarks of untreated tertiary stage syphilis. Nor were there any treatments consistent with a venereal diagnosis, no mercury purging, no bleeding rituals specific to syphilitic patients. His private physicians, meticulous and occasionally gossipy in their notes, never once mentioned syphilis or even hinted at it. But again, the truth didn't matter as much as the story. The public didn't like George II. They didn't like his foreign mannerisms, his preference for Hanover, his squabbles with his son, or his hands-off attitude toward domestic affairs. And when the people are uneasy with their monarch, they start to look for explanations. Why doesn't he smile? Why does he avoid crowds? Why is he always so irritable? Disease, real or imagined, becomes a metaphor for something else, for emotional distance, for moral rot, for the sense that the crown is no longer the symbol of unity it's supposed to be, but a mask worn over something disintegrating. So no. George II likely didn't have syphilis. He had a chronic case of royal alienation, the kind passed down through cold dynasties and colder policies. He ruled through delegation, fought with his ministers, hated his heir, and died, fittingly, on the toilet. An aortic aneurysm, quick, painless, and narratively unsatisfying. But the rumors lingered, because death didn't answer the question. It only sharpened it. And when his estranged son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, suddenly died before ever reaching the throne, young, vibrant, and full of political potential, the whispers found a new target. Another royal man, taken too early. Another illness that came without warning. Another mystery that left just enough silence to invite the same old question. Was it really just bad luck? Or was it the shadow again? The royal affliction that refused to die. 15. Frederick, Prince of Wales. He was the prince who never ruled, the son of a king who never loved him. Frederick, Prince of Wales, heir to George II, father to George III, is perhaps best remembered not for what he did, but for what he didn't. He didn't wear the crown. He didn't reconcile with his father. And, by some accounts, he didn't live long enough to escape the persistent rumor that his sudden, mysterious death wasn't just tragic. It was pathological. When he died in 1751 at the age of just 44, the public was genuinely startled. Frederick wasn't particularly ill, at least not in any public way. He had enemies, many, but he also had a strong faction behind him. Politicians, writers, aristocrats who disliked the current king and were eager for a more accessible, sympathetic monarch. Frederick played the part well. He was patron of the arts, popular among intellectuals, charming in public, and always eager to position himself as the opposite of his father. Where George II was cold, Frederick was warm. Where George was stern, Frederick played the part of the English gentleman. Or so it seemed. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he fell ill. The official cause of death was listed as a pulmonary embolism, a sudden blockage in the lungs, likely caused by a blood clot. But 18th century medicine being what it was, no autopsy confirmed this. Just a few vague descriptions from panicked physicians who arrived too late, and notes of difficulty breathing, chest pain, and collapse. No prolonged illness, no buildup. One moment he was laughing with his children, the next he was gone. The suddenness was unsettling. And as with most unsettling royal deaths, the questions followed fast. The court was quick to offer reassurances. It was natural causes. Nothing contagious. Nothing scandalous. But outside those carefully guarded palace walls, the theories bloomed. One of them, old and well-worn by now, was syphilis, not proven, not even strongly suggested by doctors. But whispered, always whispered. It didn't help that Frederick had a reputation, not scandalous by Restoration standards perhaps, but colorful enough for Georgian sensibilities. He had a string of mistresses before settling down into his public role as devoted family man. Gossip circulated about affairs with actresses, noblewomen, and, inevitably, people whose names didn't make the official record. He and his wife, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, had 9 children, but that didn't stop the rumors from bubbling beneath the surface. He was, in some corners of polite society, described as a man of appetites. It's not a diagnosis, but it was enough to plant the seed. Add to that his complex health history. While not publicly known as chronically ill, Frederick had suffered from a few vague complaints in the years prior to his death. Fatigue, headaches, irritability. He was known to complain about chest pain on occasion, and his court physician had once recorded a note about a persistent tightness in the chest. But no single condition ever took center stage. It was all background noise, until it wasn't. The theory that he died of a venereal disease emerged primarily from political satire, not medicine. Anti-monarchist pamphlets were quick to seize on the lack of clarity surrounding his death. Some suggested the prince's humors had grown corrupt. Others were more blunt, describing his illness as a silent curse, contracted in youth and fulfilled in middle age. By the time caricatures appeared in London print shops, the metaphor had fused with the man. Frederick, the decaying flower of the Hanoverian line. But was there any truth to it? Almost certainly not. Modern historians lean heavily toward the embolism theory, or possibly a ruptured lung abscess. There's also speculation about tuberculosis, which was common and often misdiagnosed, or even an aortic aneurysm, similar to the one that would later kill his father. But there's no hard evidence pointing to syphilis, no recorded lesions, no cognitive decline, no history of mercury treatments. His letters remain articulate, his memory intact, his court functioning. Still, the story stuck. Because it was familiar. Because Frederick's death was so abrupt, so narratively unresolved, that the mind rushed to fill in the blanks. After all, here was a prince who had been groomed to rule, carefully curated as the popular alternative to a stubborn king. His sudden exit felt less like fate and more like a cover-up. The public didn't just mourn, they speculated. Was this a natural tragedy or a hereditary curse? Something quietly eating its way through the bloodline, passed down from monarch to monarch like a silver spoon no one dared polish? Because if Frederick, the cheerful, charming, publicly devoted prince, had been hiding something beneath his powdered face and embroidered waistcoat, what did that say about the dynasty he almost inherited? And if his untimely death was a symptom, not a cause, then what would become of the fragile, sensitive boy he left behind? A boy who would one day become king. A boy named George. A boy whose mind would famously falter. But before madness came rumors. And before rumors came the question that would never fully be answered. What really killed Frederick, Prince of Wales? Or perhaps the better question is, what legacy did he leave behind in the bloodstream of the British crown? 16. George III of the United Kingdom. There are kings who go mad in Shakespeare plays, and then there is George III, a real king who seemed to live inside one. Crowned in 1760 at just 22 years old, he would go on to reign for 6 decades, through revolutions, regencies, and the slow, public disintegration of his own mind. His reign was defined not just by events, the loss of the American colonies, the Napoleonic Wars, the Industrial Surge, but by a single question that loomed over everything. What happened to the king? The common answer? Madness. The more complicated one? Maybe syphilis. That theory didn't start in his lifetime. It started later, when historians and amateur doctors alike tried to explain the unexplainable. How could a monarch so lucid, so intelligent, so dutiful in the early years, unravel so completely by the end. The story needed something more tangible than stress or sorrow. It needed something to blame. And so, the syphilis rumor returned. This time, cloaked in 18th century medical vocabulary. Nervous disorder, derangement, fits of distraction, melancholic distemper. The pieces were all there, weren't they? The confusion, the paranoia, the erratic speech, the physical decline, the fact that his urine turned blue, as though his body itself were trying to confess. By the early 20th century, some historians even claimed that a secret diagnosis of syphilis had been covered up by palace physicians. They pointed to strange treatments. They noted the use of restraining chairs, cold baths, and mercurial purges. To some, it was open and shut. The king was infected early, and it slowly consumed him. But in the age of scientific hindsight, this theory has been almost completely debunked. The blue urine, once thought to be the telltale sign of mercury poisoning, a common treatment for syphilis, was later explained by a different culprit, porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that interferes with the body's ability to produce heme, a component of blood. Porphyria causes a host of symptoms: abdominal pain, seizures, hallucinations, sensitivity to light, anxiety, confusion. In George III's case, it fit disturbingly well. Modern medical reviews of his symptoms, including a famous 1966 analysis published in the British Medical Journal, proposed that acute intermittent porphyria, possibly inherited, was the true source of his suffering. That theory gained traction, and today it's the leading explanation. Still tragic, still debilitating, but not contagious, not scandalous, and, perhaps most importantly for the royal image, not venereal. So why, despite all this, do the whispers of syphilis still linger in the historical margins? Because George III was too vivid a character to be remembered cleanly. This was the king who talked non-stop for hours while restrained, who once greeted a tree as the King of Prussia, who wept for hours over imagined insults, who was locked away from his own court, fed by servants through doors, and whose lucid moments became as disturbing as his delusions. In an era when mental illness was barely understood and often equated with degeneracy, syphilis became the default explanation for any cognitive collapse, especially in someone royal. It was the great equalizer. Even kings, it suggested, couldn't escape their flesh. And there's another reason. The shadow of Frederick. George III's father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, had died mysteriously, suddenly. And while Frederick never ruled, his name lingered like a ghost in George's story. If Frederick had indeed carried some unknown affliction, inherited perhaps, or contracted, then George might have been its heir in more ways than one. The idea that the sins or sicknesses of one generation might blossom in the next gave the syphilis theory poetic weight, if not medical proof. But George wasn't just a patient. He was a ruler, a deeply involved, reform-minded, frequently stubborn monarch who read every document, signed every paper, and micromanaged with the precision of a man desperate to keep his grip on everything, especially himself. And in his clarity, he was insightful, even noble. He opposed slavery. He supported agricultural reform. He cared deeply, perhaps too deeply, about his country. That's part of the tragedy. He wasn't a puppet king. He was, in many ways, England's last deeply personal monarch. His descent was public, humiliating, and prolonged, but it was also treated with increasing compassion, at least privately. By the end, his son ruled in his place. George III was confined to Windsor Castle, blind, nearly deaf, and permanently removed from the machinery of state. He died in 1820, the longest reigning British monarch at that time. He left behind a complicated legacy, a defeated empire, a restructured monarchy, a cautionary tale, but not, it seems, a venereal one. No syphilis, no infection, just a cruel twist of inherited chemistry, or possibly, if you prefer the literary explanation, the final collapse of a dynasty built on pressure, grief, and expectation. Still, the whisper never quite died. Because the next king, George IV, came with his own scandal-riddled portfolio. A man of appetites, addictions, and carefully veiled health problems. And when his body began to fail, people didn't ask what killed him. They asked who had passed it on. 17. George IV of the United Kingdom. If George III was the king who suffered privately and ruled publicly, George IV was the inverse, a man who ruled in name but lived his entire life on display. Lavish, extravagant, endlessly self-indulgent, George IV was less a monarch and more a walking monument to the decadence of Regency England. A prince obsessed with appearances. A king allergic to moderation. He didn't just inherit the throne. He inherited the full weight of public scorn, whispered gossip, and yes, once again, the quiet, persistent question. Was syphilis at work beneath the satin waistcoats and powdered wigs? The rumors started early, long before he wore the crown. As Prince of Wales, George made headlines, and enemies, with the precision of a man who seemed determined to make his life resemble a political cartoon. He racked up astronomical debts, pursued scandalous affairs, and alienated Parliament and public in equal measure. He was flamboyant, emotionally volatile, and prone to vanity on a scale that made even his royal predecessors look restrained. In many ways, George IV was a caricature of monarchy at its most absurd. And caricatures are fertile ground for disease rumors. He had mistresses, dozens of them, actresses, duchesses, even a Catholic widow he may or may not have illegally married. Maria Fitzherbert, whose name lingered around his biography like a perfume no one could quite identify. He drank heavily, gorged himself on food, and reportedly consumed opium and laudanum to deal with chronic pain. The pain, of course, raised eyebrows. What kind of pain? What kind of chronic? By the time he was in his 40s, George's health was visibly deteriorating. His face was perpetually bloated, his hands swollen, his gait unsteady. He complained of leg pain, stomach disorders, violent headaches, insomnia, and periods of extreme lethargy. Rumors swirled. Some blamed gout, others suspected dropsy or kidney failure. But the darker theory, the one whispered in salons and scribbled in marginalia, was syphilis. Not because of confirmed symptoms, not because of any physician's note or autopsy detail, but because George IV fit the profile people wanted to diagnose. He was promiscuous, he was visibly ill, and he was deeply, relentlessly unpopular. In a culture where physical illness was often read as moral commentary, syphilis was shorthand for judgment, a poetic punishment wrapped in a medical label. The actual medical history is murky, as royal records so often are. His physicians were notoriously vague in their notes, often describing his conditions in euphemisms: rheumatic affliction, nervous indisposition, digestive irregularities. But what we do know is this: George suffered from several overlapping conditions that were well documented by the end of his life: severe obesity, congestive heart failure, and what today would likely be diagnosed as type 2 diabetes. He also had chronic bladder problems and suspected porphyria, like his father. And notably, he experienced none of the hallmark symptoms of tertiary syphilis. There was no paralysis, no mental collapse, no facial lesions, no signs of mercury treatment, which was still the common recourse at the time. Despite the rumors, his mind remained mostly intact. Bitter, yes, paranoid at times, but lucid. He remained deeply involved in court politics and aesthetic decisions, micromanaging everything from palace architecture to ceremonial dress. What the record shows is a man undone not by infection, but by overindulgence. His final years were marked by grotesque physical deterioration. He was nearly blind from cataracts, weighed over 300 pounds, and had to be carried from room to room. His breath was labored, his legs ulcerated from fluid retention. But these were the symptoms of systemic collapse, not a sexually transmitted disease. Still, the syphilis story endured. Why? Because George IV was never allowed to be seen as simply ill. He had to be interpreted. His grotesqueness had to mean something. He wasn't just a man who drank too much and ate himself to death. He was a failed ideal, a symbol of monarchy's moral rot. And in that context, syphilis was never just a diagnosis. It was a metaphor, a form of narrative justice. The public saw him as England's punishment for its own indulgences, a figure who turned the throne into a chaise lounge and made governance look like a costume drama in poor taste. In an age already teetering on social upheaval and democratic demands, George IV became the embodiment of everything absurd, excessive, and unsustainable about divine rule. So, of course, people whispered he was diseased. How else could such a man be explained? He died in 1830, bloated and alone, after years of self-inflicted damage. His body was rotting from within, but not from syphilis. From years of excess, unchecked and undiagnosed. Still, the story didn't end with him, because behind him stood a brother, another aging royal with a reputation for pleasure and illegitimate children. And when William IV took the throne, the public braced for more scandal, more decline, and as always the same familiar suspicion. Maybe, just maybe, the disease hadn't died with George. Maybe it had simply changed hands. 18. William IV of the United Kingdom. William IV was not supposed to be king. He was the third son, the spare to the spare, a naval officer who spent most of his life assuming, quite reasonably, that he would die in uniform, not on a throne. But history has a habit of clearing the board. His older brothers died without legitimate heirs, and so in 1830, at the age of 64, William suddenly found himself king of the United Kingdom and Ireland. The newspapers called him the Sailor King. Less formally, some just called him Old Billy. He was not refined, he was not subtle, and to some, he was not entirely healthy. Like his older brother George IV, William came with baggage, much of it human. He fathered at least 10 illegitimate children with the actress Dorothea Bland, better known as Mrs. Jordan. Their relationship lasted over 20 years, long enough for them to set up a kind of unofficial royal household, complete with nicknames, family outings, and gossip-laden headlines. When he eventually left her for a royal marriage, to Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, it wasn't for love, but for legitimacy. The crown required heirs. The public, by then, required damage control. Despite the late marriage, no surviving children followed, and just like that, another king had failed to secure a direct line. The whispers started before the crown was even placed on his head. Too old to father. Damaged by former pleasures. Not all of him made it out of the Navy. And among the more persistent of these whispers, predictably, at this point in our journey, was the suggestion that William IV suffered from syphilis. As usual, the evidence is elusive. And as usual, the theory rests not on medical records but on atmosphere. William was known for certain ailments, joint pain, bladder trouble, occasional speech difficulties, and later in life, a tremor that worsened during public appearances. These could point to dozens of common age-related conditions, but the public, ever creative in its diagnoses, pointed to one in particular. Pamphlets and political cartoons gave him nicknames like Captain Clapp and Billy Blister. One caricature from 1832 shows him as a marionette being pulled by doctors labeled Quack and Mercury. hinting, in a not-so-subtle nod, at the contemporary treatment for syphilis. Another depicted him sailing a sinking ship called the Constitution, riddled with rot and the French disease. And yet, when we turn to the actual records, things look different. William lived to the age of 71. Not bad for a man born in the 1760s, especially one who drank heartily, smoked heavily, and had long since given up exercise. His physicians recorded minor chronic issues, but no signs of the mental deterioration, paralysis, or skin conditions associated with tertiary syphilis. His correspondence remained coherent if a bit rambling. His decisions, while sometimes impulsive, were lucid. He presided over the passage of the Reform Act of 1832, one of the most significant constitutional changes in British history. Not exactly the accomplishment of a man losing his mind to disease. In fact, William was more politically effective than expected. He was blunt, often undiplomatic, and occasionally coarse in his opinions. But he was also responsive to public pressure, sensitive to reform, and surprisingly pragmatic. He didn't try to resist the modernizing forces bearing down on the monarchy. He rode them, awkwardly but willingly, into the new age. So why did the rumors of disease persist? Because William IV, like so many of his predecessors, embodied contradiction. He was both royal and vulgar, both conservative and reformist, both father to 10 children and, in the eyes of succession law, entirely childless. His life defied clean categories, and in that confusion, disease was once again used as metaphor, to explain his failings, to discredit his politics, or simply to decorate satire with the suggestion that the king was, quite literally, unclean. It didn't help that his reign was transitional. He was the last monarch born in the 18th century and the first to rule under what looked, faintly, like a constitutional monarchy. He bridged the gap between autocracy and ceremony, between power and performance. And in doing so, he became something else, forgettable. There is no great monument to William IV, no dramatic speeches, no iconic portraits. He's often remembered as a placeholder between the self-indulgent George IV and the morally upright Victoria. A dusty chapter before the novel gets interesting. But for a man so easily dismissed, William left behind a surprisingly clean record. Not free from scandal, never that, but free from the evidence required to confirm the rumors of disease. His body, far from collapsing under the weight of a venereal affliction, simply aged, slower than expected, quieter than predicted. Still, his failure to produce an heir meant the crown passed to his niece, a young woman who would redefine the monarchy entirely. Queen Victoria, bright-eyed and relentlessly upright, seemed like a moral corrective to the male excesses before her. But not even her court would escape the whispers, because sometimes the disease isn't in the king. Sometimes it's in the blood. And as we move into the Victorian age, a new figure enters the stage, one who carried more rumors than perhaps any monarch since Henry VIII. Not about his politics, not about his power, but about what he might have passed on, quietly, incurably, through marriage. 19. Edward VII of the United Kingdom. He waited longer than any prince had before him, and longer than most would care to. By the time Edward VII finally took the throne in 1901, he was 59 years old, plump with privilege, heavy with years of anticipation, and already halfway into the twilight of his life. For most of the 19th century, he had been known not as a sovereign, but as a scandal. The charming, overfed, perennially idle eldest son of Queen Victoria, who privately referred to him as Dear Bertie, and publicly treated him like an administrative oversight. Edward VII was a walking contradiction. He represented the tail end of Victorian restraint but lived like a French duke in a satire. The court of Queen Victoria may have been defined by mourning, lace, and sermons, but Bertie's private life looked more like champagne, racehorses, and discreet house calls. He was known for his mistresses, so many mistresses, including actresses, aristocrats, married women, and courtesans who could command entire columns in the Parisian press. And where there are mistresses, rumors never lag far behind. And in Bertie's case, the most persistent rumor of all was, predictably, syphilis. It wasn't whispered. It was suggested in editorials, joked about in private clubs, and sometimes flung outright by political opponents. His mother was said to have feared it. His critics assumed it. His doctors, as usual, said nothing. But the twist in Edward VII's case was that the rumor didn't center on him. Not directly. It centered on his wife. Alexandra of Denmark, the princess who became his queen, was known for her poise, beauty, and unwavering public composure. But beneath the surface, her life was marked by deep and persistent health problems, including a form of arthritis so severe it left her with a lifelong limp by her mid-30s. That condition, long misunderstood, gave rise to a speculative diagnosis: gonorrheal arthritis, sometimes associated with secondary infections contracted through sexual transmission. The logic, for those inclined to build a scandal, was circular and brutal. Bertie had affairs. Bertie was exposed. Bertie brought it home. Alexandra suffered. Therefore, Bertie must have had syphilis. The theory flourished not in medical reports, but in the Victorian imagination, an imagination already inflamed by moral anxieties about sex, class, and power. Here was a royal consort, visibly afflicted, aging before her time, and married to a man whose carnal reputation was as bloated as his waistline. What else could be going on? But here's the problem. The facts don't quite cooperate. Alexandra's condition, known today as chronic osteoarthritis, was not venereal. Modern medical reassessments of her symptoms, joint swelling, mobility issues, pain exacerbated by cold weather, point to a degenerative condition unrelated to sexually transmitted diseases. There is no indication she ever received treatments common for syphilis or gonorrhea, such as mercury or arsenic. No mention of chancres, rashes, or systemic degeneration. Her mind remained sharp. Her public duties were executed, even as her body declined. And what about Edward himself? For a man with such a rich history of misbehavior, his medical records are surprisingly dull. Yes, he had gout. Yes, he was overweight, diabetic, and suffered from bronchitis. But there are no confirmed records of venereal disease treatment. No mercury compounds, no neurological decay, no tabes dorsalis, which would have caused him to stagger and lose motor control in later years. He continued to travel, dine, attend state functions, and, despite his age and girth, maintain a lifestyle most 40-year-old bachelors couldn't keep up with. If Edward VII had syphilis, he carried it with the grace of a myth, visible in imagination, absent in evidence. So why does the rumor endure? Because it fits. Because it flatters a cultural narrative. The decadent prince, the long-suffering wife, the cursed monarchy. It makes sense emotionally, even when it falls apart medically. In an age where the body was supposed to reflect the soul, and disease was seen as the wage of sin, syphilis became more than an illness. It became an emblem. Edward VII died in 1910 of a series of heart attacks. His body, weakened by decades of overindulgence, simply gave out. There was no final breakdown, no collapse into madness, no dramatic confession from a royal physician. Just a slow end to a fast life. And yet, as always, the stain of rumor outlived the man, because his reign, brief though it was, served as a bridge between two worlds, the aristocratic 19th century and the industrial, increasingly democratic 20th. And in that uneasy handoff, the old fears lingered, including the fear that the disease didn't die with a generation of powdered wigs and opera boxes, because Edward's eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, never became king. But he died young, mysteriously, and in his absence a much darker theory began to bloom, one that made the whispers about syphilis seem almost quaint. Because when a royal dies young, unmarried, and with secrets unspoken, the story doesn't end. It just slips into the shadows, waiting. 20. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Some royal figures leave behind legacies of statecraft, war, reform, or scandal. Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, heir to the throne, left behind something else, a vacuum, a strange, echoing absence, shaped not by what he did, but by what people later imagined he might have done. And in that silence, rumor grew like mold. Known to his family as Eddie, Albert Victor was the eldest son of Edward VII and thus second in line to the British throne after his father. For a brief, uneasy period in the late 19th century, he represented the future of the monarchy. Tall, blue-eyed, and photogenic in a waxwork sort of way, he looked the part. But behind the uniform and the carefully styled mustache, Eddie puzzled just about everyone who met him. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman, kind, polite, vague, terminally vague. His tutors described him as amiable and industrious when pressed, which is code for slow. Others were less diplomatic. Some said he was intellectually underwhelming. Others hinted at deeper problems: a lack of grasp, a fog, a mental dullness inconsistent with his breeding. The whispers never stopped, nor did the speculation about his health, his intellect, or his capacity to rule. And then he died. At the age of 28, Albert Victor caught a severe bout of influenza during the global pandemic of 1891-92, the so-called Russian flu. Within days, it became pneumonia. Within a week, he was dead. Officially, it was natural causes. A tragic but not unprecedented loss. The British royal family had a long and well-documented history of unexpected deaths, inherited weaknesses, and bad luck with winter epidemics. But from the very moment the death was announced, the air around it felt different. Too sudden, too convenient, too empty. Which is precisely where the rumors crept in. One of the earliest, and most persistent, was that Albert Victor had been suffering from a long-term, undisclosed illness. Something debilitating, something incurable, something that would have made his ascension to the throne a constitutional nightmare. The most whispered culprit: syphilis. There was no proof, of course, but this was the fin de siècle, the twilight of the Victorian age, when people had begun to suspect that the monarchy was not, in fact, immune to the consequences of private vice. The idea that Eddie, the too beautiful, too silent heir, had been infected with a disease of shameful origin was simply irresistible. The speculation grew legs thanks to his rumored associations. Some pointed to his alleged involvement in the Cleveland Street scandal, a notorious 1889 case in which a male brothel frequented by aristocrats and reportedly young guardsmen was raided by police. Several prominent men were implicated. Albert Victor's name surfaced, though never formally, and no charges were filed. But once the association was made, it lingered. Then came the bigger myth, the one that overshadowed all others, that Prince Albert Victor was Jack the Ripper. Yes, that Jack the Ripper. The Whitechapel killer who stalked the streets of London in 1888, whose identity remains one of the most hotly debated mysteries in criminal history. At some point in the mid-20th century, a theory emerged that the murders had been covered up by the government to protect a high-ranking royal, and Eddie, already surrounded by rumors of mental instability and secret disease, became the prime suspect in certain speculative circles. Historians have since discredited the idea completely. He wasn't even in London during several of the murders. His alibis are solid. The theory survives not because it's credible, but because it's compelling. The idea of a prince gone mad, lashing out in alleys, protected by palace silence. But why Eddie? Why not some other royal? Because he was already being framed as damaged. Already the subject of whispers. Already the royal family's tragic question mark. The syphilis rumor was part of that construction. If he had been infected, perhaps through an affair, or from a prostitute, or even inherited from his father, then it would explain everything. His foggy intellect, his quiet nature, his early death, his absence from history. And in a sense, that's what made the rumor so powerful. It filled a space where legacy should have been. Prince Albert Victor left behind no children, no reforms, no policies, no speeches. Just unanswered questions and a photo album of a young man whose story ended too early. A man who was one heartbeat from the throne and who left behind only silence. His younger brother George, more robust, more serious, more conventional, would take his place in the line of succession. He would become George V, and the crown would move on, draped in black but determined to forget. But some stains are harder to erase. The rumors about Eddie, about disease, madness, scandal, and silence remained in the bloodstream of royal history, dormant, unresolved, and passed on like folklore. Because when a prince dies at 28 and the doctors say flu and the courtiers say nothing, the public will always say something else. 21st Princess Charlotte of Wales. She was the royal family's great hope. And then she was gone. Princess Charlotte of Wales, only child of George IV and Caroline of Brunswick, was the single thread tying together the chaotic, scandal-drenched Hanoverian monarchy with the possibility of a cleaner, more promising future. She was young, spirited, politically popular, and remarkably well-liked. A rarity for a royal in Regency England, especially one born from a marriage as notoriously dysfunctional as her parents. Her death at age 21 in 1817 shocked the nation. But it was the rumors that followed her husband that gave rise to something more insidious. Charlotte didn't just die. She died in childbirth, after more than 50 hours of labor. The stillbirth of a son. A healthy young princess reduced to silence overnight. The national grief was immense. Black crepe sold out across the country. People wept openly in the streets. Shops closed in mourning. The shockwave was cultural, political, and deeply personal. For the first time in a generation, the British public had found a royal to root for, and then lost her. But while the official story focused on medical mismanagement, an incompetent doctor, outdated methods, and a system that saw childbirth as a private duty rather than a national concern, the unofficial story took a darker turn. What if Charlotte hadn't been the sick one? What if her husband was? Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, later King of the Belgians, was widely praised in the immediate aftermath of Charlotte's death. Stoic, devastated, dignified, the perfect grieving widower. But some corners of British society didn't buy it. Too perfect, too composed. And why, they asked, had the pregnancy been so difficult? Why had Charlotte, young and previously healthy, suffered such a catastrophic labor? The questions led to speculation. The speculation led to accusations. And one of the quietest, most persistent of those accusations was that Leopold had brought something into the marriage. Something venereal. Was it syphilis? Gonorrhea? Something hereditary? No one could say for sure. But the logic, if you could call it that, followed the old pattern. Unexplained tragedy must be rooted in scandal. If the child was stillborn and the mother died shortly after, it couldn't just be an accident. It had to be corruption. Royal blood had to be tainted. Satirical newspapers didn't dare say it outright. But in veiled poems and whispery editorials they hinted at a foreign blight, a continental inheritance, a curse cloaked in love. It wasn't Charlotte they accused. It was Leopold. He was foreign. He was quiet. He came from the same extended family tree that had already begun to show signs of genetic strain. And most of all, he lived. He lived while England's princess died. None of it was fair. None of it was grounded in medical fact. Charlotte's own physicians admitted fault, albeit too late to matter. Her obstetrician, Sir Richard Croft, blamed himself so deeply that he later died by suicide, a tragic footnote in a story already thick with grief. But that didn't stop the rumors. In the absence of answers, syphilis was once again floated as a metaphor, a narrative tool to explain the inexplicable. It was never diagnosed. It was never even seriously suggested by doctors. But it didn't have to be. It had already been planted in the minds of a public increasingly skeptical of their royal family and all the secrets it might be hiding behind nursery doors and funeral veils. Leopold would go on to remarry and eventually become the first king of the Belgians. His reputation recovered, at least in Europe. But in England, Charlotte's absence continued to cast a long shadow over his legacy. He never produced an heir in England. He never ruled. And for many, he remained the quiet figure who walked out of a death room while the country collapsed into mourning. Princess Charlotte's death changed British history. It triggered a succession crisis. It forced her uncles to scramble for legitimate marriages. It directly led to the birth of Queen Victoria. But it also served as a turning point in how the public viewed royal health. No longer just a matter of medical interest, it became a national obsession, a symbol of stability or decay. And the idea that a foreign prince might bring disease into the line of succession? That stuck. Because after Charlotte, the royal family doubled down on appearances, on morality, on control. But no amount of lace, mourning gowns, or carefully arranged portraits could erase the growing suspicion that something in the bloodline, something invisible, was traveling silently from one generation to the next. And it didn't stop with Charlotte. Because one of the uncles who rushed to marry in her absence, Prince Augustus Frederick, would also become the subject of quiet, persistent rumors. Not for what he did, but for how often he seemed to be hiding something. Something that never made it into official portraits. Something that once again started with a whisper and ended with a question. 22nd. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex. Among Queen Victoria's many uncles, Prince Augustus Frederick was the least politically threatening and perhaps the most personally compelling. A younger son of George III, he lacked the military swagger of the Duke of Wellington or the dynastic importance of his brothers. But what he did have was an unusually independent streak for a royal, which in Hanoverian England was often confused with a sign of moral weakness. Or worse, something contagious. Augustus Frederick, created Duke of Sussex in 1801, was a man out of sync with his time. He was intellectual, reform-minded, deeply interested in science and literature. He was also plagued by ill health for much of his life. Respiratory troubles, chronic pain, skin irritations, and fatigue dogged him well into adulthood. On more than one occasion, he withdrew from public life for long periods due to exhaustion and constitutional weakness. Euphemisms that, while common for the time, often functioned as placeholders for something more whispered. And the whispers, as always, came. The first of them surfaced in the 1820s, long after his health had already started to decline but well before he'd retreated fully from public life. Court gossips described him as unwell in the peculiar manner of the diseased nobility. Others said he had inherited not only royal blood, but certain royal afflictions. The language was coy, coded, and unrelenting. It didn't help that Augustus was unconventional in other ways. He married twice, both times without royal consent, rendering his unions legally invalid under the Royal Marriages Act. His first wife, Lady Augusta Murray, was of noble but not royal blood. Their marriage, though loving, was annulled by the crown. The children they had together were considered illegitimate, cut off from succession, and erased from courtly mention. This public rebuke of tradition cast a long shadow. What kind of royal, people wondered, refused to play by the rules unless he had something to hide? What illness, what guilt, what secret had driven Augustus into domestic rebellion? It wasn't enough that his health was failing. It had to mean something. The syphilis rumor, whispered in salons, scribbled in marginalia, fit neatly into the cultural template. Here was a royal man who had broken marital protocol, whose physical strength had visibly declined, whose political ambition had shriveled into private study. Some said his hands trembled. Others described his skin as strangely discolored. A few claimed he suffered from bouts of confusion and melancholy, increasingly isolated from his family. Put together, it sounded, to a 19th century imagination hungry for symmetry, like late-stage syphilis. And yet, as with so many others on this list, the historical evidence simply doesn't hold. There's no documented use of mercury, the era's go-to treatment. No recorded breakdowns of the mind. No physician's notes describing neurological decline, lesions, or organ failure consistent with advanced infection. His ailments, though frequent, appear to be chronic rather than progressive. He suffered from asthma and possibly some form of autoimmune condition, perhaps lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, as modern biographers have speculated. Even more damning to the rumor is the fact that Augustus lived a long life. He died in 1843 at the age of 70. Not ancient, but certainly not the age you'd expect for someone allegedly battling untreated syphilis in the early 19th century. His final years were spent quietly but lucidly, surrounded by books, friends, and fellow scholars. So why did the suspicion cling to him? Part of it was timing. Augustus lived during a period when venereal disease was rampant in Europe's upper classes, but discussed only in hushed tones. If a man was visibly unwell and unmarried, the assumptions were nearly automatic. If he was unmarried twice, the implications multiplied. And if he also happened to disappear from public life, just as his body began to show signs of wear, the rumors were cemented. And part of it was symbolic. Augustus, more than his brothers, represented a different model of royalty. One that prioritized private conviction over public duty. He supported Catholic emancipation, spoke against slavery, and openly championed education reform. He collected rare books, corresponded with scientists, and was elected president of the Royal Society, all marks of a man deeply engaged with the world beyond the throne. But in a monarchy that still measured worth by marriage, military service, and heirs, such intellectualism could look suspicious, deviant, diseased. The real tragedy of Augustus Frederick wasn't any alleged affliction. It was that his refusal to follow the rigid protocols of his lineage left him exposed to a kind of reputational erosion. He wasn't monstrous. He was marginal. And in royal circles, marginality is its own kind of contagion. When he died, his funeral was simple, almost private. He requested burial not in the official vault at Windsor, but at Kensal Green Cemetery, a quiet rebellion against tradition to the very end. Still, the gossip didn't end with him. Another brother, Prince Ernest Augustus, carried the same bloodline, but none of the gentleness. His scandals were louder, his political enemies more numerous, and the rumors about his body far more vicious. And when the satirists turned their gaze on Ernest, they didn't ask if he was diseased. They simply asked how many people knew, and how many had been paid not to say. 23rd, Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland and King of Hanover. If Prince Augustus Frederick was the forgotten intellectual of George III's brood, Prince Ernest Augustus, his younger brother, was the cautionary tale. Where Augustus sought privacy, Ernest attracted controversy. Where Augustus broke royal tradition quietly, Ernest shattered it with a sneer. By the time he inherited the throne of Hanover in 1837, he had already become one of the most disliked figures in British royal history. And naturally, where dislike accumulates, so too do the rumors. Some political, some personal, and one, persistent, grotesque, impossible to prove, medical. Yes, syphilis. Again. The accusation that Ernest may have suffered from the great pox wasn't invented out of thin air, nor was it uniquely tied to his health. It was part of a wider narrative, a swirl of scandals, court cases, character assassinations, and public fury that followed him for decades. Unlike his more private siblings, Ernest's sins, real and alleged, were headline-ready. And by the mid-1800s, the British public had come to view him not as a man, but as a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy's unfiltered line of succession. Born in 1771, Ernest was the fifth son of George III. He served in the army, fought in the Napoleonic Wars, lost an eye in battle, and emerged from military life with the stubborn, grim-faced righteousness of a man who believed he had earned the right to say whatever he liked, however he liked, and he did, regularly, loudly. But the trouble with Ernest wasn't just his bluntness. It was the trail of scandal he left in his wake. In 1810, he was accused of attempted assault by his valet, Joseph Sellis, who was later found dead from a grisly throat wound in what was officially deemed a suicide. The coroner's report said Sellis had taken his own life after fabricating the accusation, but the court of public opinion, skeptical even then, wasn't convinced. Many believed Ernest had orchestrated a cover-up, and from that moment, he was rarely seen as innocent of anything. The rumors snowballed. He was accused of political manipulation, anti-Catholic bigotry, mistreating servants, and scheming behind the scenes to undermine his siblings. He was even rumored to have married his own niece, Princess Alexandrina, a charge for which there is no evidence, and which was later dismissed, but not before it poisoned his reputation even further. In this environment, it's no surprise that suggestions of a venereal disease followed close behind. The satirists didn't hold back. Caricatures of Ernest often showed him with pockmarked skin, bulging eyes, and twisted limbs, the visual shorthand for syphilitic infection. Broadsheets referred to his tainted blood, his withered form, and one particularly vicious cartoon depicted him as a monarch literally dissolving into a pool of disease corruption, while his crown floated helplessly above him. As with many royals in this saga, the syphilis rumor attached itself not through documented medical evidence, but through reputational gravity. Ernest was already perceived as morally compromised. Therefore, the body had to reflect that. Disease became a kind of cosmic confirmation, poetic justice in medical drag. But what does the historical record say? Not much. Ernest Augustus lived to be 80 years old. His personal physicians, whose notes remain relatively sparse, never reported mercury treatments, the standard, if crude, intervention for syphilis at the time. There are no references to neurological decline, which would have been expected if he were suffering from tertiary stage complications. His eyesight was damaged, but from a war wound, not from optic nerve deterioration associated with advanced syphilitic infection. His mind remained sharp, his speeches coherent, and his political strategies coldly effective to the end. The real source of the rumor seems to have been the court of public perception, a place where reputation, once damaged, metastasizes. Ernest's personality didn't help. He was dismissive of press criticism, openly disdainful of popular opinion, and unapologetically reactionary. For reformists and satirists, he was the perfect villain. A man out of step with the modern world, clinging to power with one hand and swatting away accountability with the other. And so, when he became King of Hanover in 1837, a separate crown taken when Salic law barred Queen Victoria from inheriting that throne, the British public exhaled in relief. He was gone. Banished, more or less, to the German backwater that had birthed the royal family in the first place. But even in exile, the narrative clung. Rumors of disease, especially sexually transmitted disease, are rarely about diagnosis. They are about disgust, projection, a desire to map moral decay onto physical form. Ernest, with his arrogance and defiance, became an ideal subject. And yet, the evidence never came. His reign in Hanover was conservative, autocratic, and relatively stable. When he died in 1851, it wasn't from wasting disease or neurological collapse. It was old age, quiet, unremarkable. He was buried with full honors. Still, in England, few mourned. For many, he had already been buried long ago, beneath rumor, satire, and the slow rot of public disdain. But the Hanoverian line didn't end with Ernest. It continued. And so did the royal body's uneasy relationship with public scrutiny. The next subject, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, Queen Victoria's youngest son, would inherit a very different kind of suspicion. Not born from scandal, but from frailty, from a body that broke too easily, and a medical diagnosis misunderstood by a public still searching for someone to blame. 24. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. He was Queen Victoria's youngest son, the child she often described as her clever one, and yet the most fragile of all her brood. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, was born in 1853 with a body that seemed determined to betray him from the start. Unlike his brothers who took up military commissions or embarked on diplomatic adventures, Leopold's life was defined by limits. He could not fight. He could not ride for long. He could not take part in the rough and tumble of aristocratic sport. His condition, later understood to be hemophilia, kept him under constant watch. And yet, somehow, despite the obvious explanation, whispers rose around him that his frailty was not just genetic misfortune, but something darker, something imported, something venereal. The rumor that Leopold might have suffered from syphilis was never based on medical evidence. It was born from the cruel logic of Victorian gossip. A sick prince must have been shamed by something. A wasting disease that made him pale, that left him prone to sudden bleeds and collapses, must have a narrative that reflected moral failing. To the public imagination, hereditary illness was too sterile, too impersonal. They wanted cause, blame, a scandal that explained why the Queen's beloved youngest son was constantly being carted from one health retreat to another. Leopold's hemophilia was not fully understood in his lifetime. Doctors spoke of his weak constitution, his delicate veins, his predisposition to bleeding. He bruised easily. Minor accidents became medical emergencies. He required constant supervision. His mother fretted over him endlessly, sometimes excessively. Victoria's letters reveal her exasperation as much as her devotion. She alternated between fierce protectiveness and thinly veiled frustration that her son's illness barred him from the robust path expected of princes. Into this medical confusion crept rumor. Some pamphleteers, seizing on his constant ailments, called him tainted. A few even suggested he had inherited a family infection. What else could account for a child so unlucky? The disease of kings, they said, was coursing through the veins of Britain's youngest duke. Never mind that his symptoms, uncontrolled bleeding, joint pain, chronic anemia, bore no resemblance to the rashes, lesions, or neurological damage associated with syphilis. The public didn't care for detail. They cared for metaphor. And syphilis, in Victorian England, had become shorthand for hidden sin. Leopold lived with this shadow, even as he tried to carve out a life within his restrictions. He was exceptionally intelligent, passionate about literature, art, and politics. He cultivated friendships with artists, writers, and thinkers who admired his wit and curiosity. Some said he had the sharpest mind of all Victoria's sons, and perhaps the most humane. But intellectual strength did not translate into physical freedom. He walked carefully, played cautiously, and traveled only under strict medical supervision. In 1882, at the age of 29, he married Princess Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont. The marriage was reportedly affectionate, producing 2 children. But even this moment of personal triumph did not erase the murmurings. Skeptics questioned whether a man so often bedridden, so frequently under a doctor's care, could truly fulfill the marital role expected of him. And when his health worsened, the old whispers reawakened. Perhaps it wasn't just hemophilia. Perhaps there was something unspoken, something shameful. The truth came swiftly and mercilessly. In 1884, while visiting Cannes, Leopold slipped and fell, striking his head. The injury triggered a cerebral hemorrhage. Hemophilia magnified the damage. He died at just 30 years old. His death certificate made no mention of syphilis, of course. It listed the cause plainly: cerebral hemorrhage due to hemophilia. A genetic curse, not a venereal one. But again, rumor outlived fact. His early death, his frailty, his inability to meet the muscular expectations of Victorian masculinity, all of it was too neatly explained by the language of contagion. To some, he remained the sick prince. To others, he was the tainted one. And in both cases, syphilis was the convenient explanation. What Leopold actually carried was a mutation, passed silently through the female line, destined to haunt European royal families for generations. Hemophilia spread through his sisters and their descendants, turning childbirth, childhood, and even simple accidents into mortal dangers. It was not scandalous. It was cruel. And it was real. Yet in the Victorian imagination, reality was never enough. For every genuine medical mystery, there had to be a whisper of shame. Leopold was mourned as a victim of hereditary weakness, but also muttered about as if he had been the secret bearer of something unclean. He deserved better. Still, the whisper did its work. By the time Edward VIII came to the throne nearly half a century later, the public had grown accustomed to folding scandal into illness, and illness into scandal. And when that king fell, not from frailty but from choice, it was inevitable that the old rumor would return one last time. Because when a monarch abdicates, the people rarely ask why. They ask what was wrong with him. And once again someone answered, syphilis. 25. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Few monarchs have managed to transform themselves into mysteries quite as thoroughly as Edward VIII. His reign lasted less than a year. His abdication in 1936 altered the entire trajectory of the monarchy. And his life afterward, as Duke of Windsor, self-styled exile, and perpetual symbol of scandal, was a long shadow that stretched across the rest of the 20th century. His choice to leave the throne for Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, shocked the establishment and titillated the press. But beneath the official explanations about love and duty, there was always another whisper, another suggestion, another convenient explanation for why a king would abandon his crown. Syphilis. The rumor emerged almost immediately after his abdication, as if the public couldn't quite believe that love alone had caused a monarch to walk away from his empire. Abdications were rare, catastrophic things. They needed more weight, more intrigue, more darkness. The idea that Edward was sick, incurably, scandalously sick, filled the void. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Edward was known for his erratic moods, his bursts of energy followed by periods of lethargy. He was slim to the point of looking frail, his appearance marked by nervous gestures and rapid speech. He was famously restless, fidgeting during official duties, rarely able to focus on paperwork or the endless ceremonial obligations of monarchy. Some saw this as immaturity. Others, with a more scandalous imagination, interpreted it as symptomology. Adding to the suspicion was his notorious social life before he met Wallace. As Prince of Wales in the 1920s and early 30s, Edward was a fixture of nightclubs, cocktail parties, and private salons across Europe. He cultivated relationships with aristocrats, showgirls, and married women. His companions included courtiers with reputations for extravagance and women who were whispered about in ways Victorian society would never have tolerated. In such circles, the possibility of exposure to venereal disease was, in the public imagination, simply assumed. But the actual medical record tells a different story. Edward VIII's health problems were real but relatively ordinary. He had chronic digestive issues, particularly ulcers, which plagued him for years. He was prone to colds and respiratory ailments, and later in life he developed throat cancer, likely from heavy smoking. None of these align with syphilis. There are no records of mercury treatments, no mention of skin lesions, no accounts of neurological decline. His mental faculties, whatever one might say of his judgment, remained intact. He lived into his late 70s, active and articulate to the end. That longevity alone strongly argues against untreated syphilis, which, by that stage of medicine, was a disease that left visible and undeniable scars. So why did the rumor stick? Because Edward VIII was the perfect vessel for it. He embodied contradiction. A man born into supreme privilege who seemed to resent it. A king who became a symbol of romantic sacrifice but also political weakness. A royal who spoke warmly of Nazi leaders in the 1930s, casting his reputation into a fog of suspicion that never fully cleared. To many, he was never trustworthy. To some, he was never fully explainable. And when history struggles to explain, rumor rushes in to assist. Syphilis gave his story a moral arc, the restless playboy prince undone by his own indulgence. The abdication explained not by inconvenient love, but by incurable disease. The exile reframed as medical necessity rather than personal choice. For a society still fascinated by scandal, this explanation was irresistible. But it also reveals something larger about the monarchy itself. Again and again, when a royal behaves in ways the public cannot comprehend, illness is invoked. Not just any illness, but this illness. The one that speaks of corruption, of weakness, of unfitness to rule. It is less a diagnosis than a cultural shorthand, a way of turning political discomfort into moral certainty. Edward VIII did not need syphilis to explain his downfall. His abdication was enough. His politics, his sympathy for authoritarian figures, his inability to take on responsibility, his disdain for the grind of monarchy, were damning on their own. But rumor does not thrive on adequacy. It thrives on drama. And so, the disease followed him, not as reality, but as narrative. He died in 1972 in Paris, far from the throne he had once briefly occupied. Wallace, frail and silent, outlived him. Their story remains one of the most famous love scandals of modern monarchy. Yet behind the official romance, behind the photographs and documentaries, the whisper persists that maybe, just maybe, the king who would not be king was hiding something more than a love affair. With Edward VIII, the cycle of rumor comes full circle. From Edward IV in the 15th century to Edward VIII in the 20th, the royal family has been shadowed by the same suspicion, that syphilis, the great pox, lurked somewhere inside the crown, rarely proven, rarely disproven, but always suggested. Not because the royals were uniquely diseased, but because they were uniquely visible. In the end, the story says less about the kings and queens themselves than about the society watching them. A society desperate to make sense of mystery. A society that wanted morality written into medicine, scandal into sickness, shame into symptoms. And in that sense, the real infection wasn't in the bloodlines at all. It was in the imagination.